Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra. Today we are going to look at a module titled Dominance Without Hegemony. All of us know who Ranjit Guha was, and one of his famous works is called Dominance Without Hegemony. In this module, we will try and learn that the historiography of the colonial period talks only about the nationalist elite as one homogeneous group, the urban educated intellectuals. However, this module will try and deconstruct this particular myth about politics of the elite, and also will talk about the subaltern politics that has remained invisible for a very long time. Historiography as a site of power struggles. So where do we start digging for evidence of the contradictions that besieged both the colonial government and the Indian nationalist leaders? Guha chose historiography since it witnessed tussles for hegemony, defined as a condition in which persuasion outweighs coercion between the two parties. The genesis of this discontent could be found in the criticism levied by Indian intellectuals against the colonial administration. Since then, there has been a steady stream of criticism. However, Ranjit Guha, that most of the critics assume singular integrated domain of politics during that period. What they don't realize that the field was actually bifurcated into autonomous spheres, the elite and the subaltern. The assumptions about unitary domain of politics stem from the idea that it was the effect of the homogenizing influence of colonialism. Both kinds of historiographies, neo-colonialist and nationalist, boil down the myriad and complicated realm of politics to just elite contestation, ignoring the voice of the subordinate. While the neo-colonialist version perceived the colonial rule as a munificent order, introducing liberal education and incorporating the natives into politics by giving them multiple incentives, the activities of the Western educated elite were the only thing that mattered. The nationalist historiography, on the other hand, only captured the elite's response to the government and encapsulated all its activities. The mass, comprising of laboring class and other intermediary strata, are considered to be passive pawns in the hands of the dominant groups, who use them as it suits their strategies. But Guha insists that the subaltern politics is a separate realm and unique realm altogether. To demonstrate this, Guha tries dissecting the colonial state using the historiographical approach. The colonial state, unlike its originator, the metropolitan bourgeoisie state, has no hegemony, since it relies upon coercive military power and not persuasion. Since it has not been able to assimilate the civil society of the civilized within its fold, it is not hegemonic. It negates the prevailing misconception in the academia with the ascendancy of the bourgeoisie in Western Europe. All of the power relations of civil society have everywhere been so fully assimilated to those of the state. Guha is extremely skeptical of the colonialist historiography claim about the supposed hegemony of the colonial state. Besides the colonial state, dominance without hegemony applies to the native bourgeoisie. They could not assimilate the consciousness of the masses either, and as such, their attempts to speak for the nation were thwarted. Therefore, it was a battle for hegemony between the two parties. Inauguration of colonialist historiography in South Asia. Guha outlines the circumstances under which the first colonial historian was born. In 1765, with the East India Company taking over the post of Diwani, the official had to be apprised of the structure of landed property in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. Dubbing it as the inaugural moment of the Raj, he argues that the grant to collect land revenue of eastern provinces and to administer civil services consolidated the colonial conquest. A triplicate of coercion, exploitation of land's produce and the semblance of legality laid the foundation of the regime. Also, this spawned the initial attempts to build bureaucratic machinery, which was well attuned to its twin functions. This entailed understanding the existing power relations. More specifically, it needed data about the volume and value of agricultural produce, the rules for extracting agricultural produce, the technicalities of estate accounts, and nature of land tenures. This meant a deep understanding of the intricacies of tradition and past processes, essentially an understanding of history. It also stemmed from bureaucratic concerns about how to determine inheritance along lines of descent among the rich families. And this is where the first sign of elitist bias crops up. However, the best know-how accessible to the native expert was denied to the company's officials. The standoff between the company and the indigenous population antedated the accession, as evident in 1761, when Verslit's council in Chittagong encountered reluctance of the latter to share information about management of revenue. In 1786, James Grant reported that a loss of around 15 million rupees had resulted due to the refusal to share knowledge used instead for individual enrichment. The tensions were exacerbated as territories under Raj's purview expanded. The revenues increased and the complications and tenurial structures and accounting procedures multiplied. The more the officials failed to manage the increased revenues, the complicated tenurial structures and accounting procedures, the more accounts presented the natives as inferior. As such, Warren Hastings' prototype of native as cooperative informants fell through, thus raising doubts about hegemonic role of Western wisdom. The chasm grew further with the avarice underlining the farming system, the accelerated tax collections and the destruction of landed families owing to the stress of excessive fiscal demands, etc. To avoid getting duped, the British launched the initiative to write Indian history from the point of view. There was essentially three kinds of historical dissertations. Firstly, extensive surveys written as political histories in which the ruling dynasties and changing circumstances, for instance, Alexander Dow's The History of Hindustan. Secondly, narratives about dynastic histories which focus on the economy, for instance, Grant's work. And thirdly, official reports about the relationship of power and property, but at the local level. The collection of narratives altogether constituted colonial historiography, predictated not on the basis of a genuine need to disseminate liberal culture, but on the need to fulfill its material and political interests. Not only the purpose, but also the style of writing marked a significant departure from the native chronicles. The writers drawing on European and Whig historiography converted the diachronic remembrance of past into a more general, distanced, objective historical account. History thus sounded the death knell on tradition. Colonial historiography was a convenient smokescreen for legitimizing the Raj. The accounts projected local aristocracies as the rightful owners of land, and then, through the construction of genealogies from antiquity and Mughal charters, tried to establish this as a long historical tradition in India to legitimize zamindari settlement. This helped guise the disruption brought in by Western meddling into a nation's landed property. By embellishing details of conquests, starting from Turk-Afghans, they tried to naturalize the extraction of tribute by the conquerors. Ultimately, these worked in favor of the Raj, which got entrenched as a rule on property and silenced all its critics. Gradually, the individual accounts were turned into full-fledged discourses, spanning the time period from Mill's History of British India to Hunter's Indian Empire, which highlighted the victories of the colonial state. Whenever Indian history was incorporated into those accounts, there was deliberate effort to characterize the difference between an affluent Western power and poor Asian subjects, between higher and lower levels of civilization, between superior religion of Christianity and barbaric superstitious indigenous belief systems. Moreover, liberal colonialist histories of the Raj exaggerated the universalizing tendency of capital, that is, its capacity to replicate its conditions, that is, not just mode of production but also the accompanying liberal culture as in the West. But Guha argues that the universalizing tendency is in fact one of the biggest inconsistencies underlying capitalism. The liberal colonialist histories assumed that all pre-capitalist relations have to be subsumed by capital, thus endowing it with hegemony, a practice repeated by nationalist accounts as well. At the same time, the appropriation of indigenous history enabled natives to redefine their identity. They used those very differences to distinguish themselves politically and culturally from their rulers. Thus, history became the battleground for both the parties' claims and counterclaims. To illustrate the fallacy of feudal historiography, Guha mentions the historian Kalhana, who authored Rajata Rajini. Although Kalhana held himself to high standards of neutrality and objectivity evident in his critical analysis of the rule of his patrons, and although he did raise doubts about the absence of popular uprising, he was deeply embedded in the superstitious fears of his time. For instance, he ended up attributing the cruelty of a king to the will of gods. Kalhana's historical accounts were not only stuck within the confines of feudal conceptual universe, but were also part of a political propaganda to persuade rulers of Kashmir to put their house in order. Basham, his harshest critic, ironically ended up committing the same mistake when he characterized his work as entertaining and instructing the royals. Thus, in both instances, history became an accomplice to treatises on politics. Guha contends that a genuine critique of ruling culture can only be sourced from a historically antagonistic universe. For instance, Aristotle's pro-slavery work was denounced by Montesquieu and Hegel, pleading the cause of natural equality and universal equality. Both the stances can be traced to an era of rise of bourgeoisie ideology in Western society. This era also witnessed the emergence of a rationalistic vision and abstracted humanism, which signals the gradual disappearance of all feudal beliefs and ideologies. For instance, Majumdar and Basham criticized Kalhana's obsession with magic, witchcraft and karma for lacking logic and neglecting the role of man in creating his destiny. Therefore, history is riddled with precedents wherein an ideology countering the ruling culture precedes the ascendancy of a class for which it speaks, epitomized by the bourgeoisie class. The latter, during the Enlightenment, waged a war on the feudal regime, including its mode of production and power relations, and gradually was able to replace it. Similarly, the critique of bourgeoisie ideology must materialize from outside and must seize the real contradictions inherent in capitalism to shake their foundations. A coterie of alternative ideals, values, and lens will help reorient the dominant liberalism perspective. While the ideology may not actually make a dent in the material base of the bourgeoisie structure and its infancy, yet the highlighting of the lacunae in the institution does not pave the way for its eventual destruction. Disciplining and mobilizing tactics. Guha reiterates that dominance was established at two levels, not just through the Raj, but also through the indigenous elites' control over the subaltern population. He stated that historiography projected the idiom of improvement as proof of the Raj's liberal character. Antagonistic masses were sought to be replicated through extension of patronage to local arts, missionary efforts to elevate lives of the marginalized, preservation of Indian heritage, etc. Even the teaching of history in schools had a debilitating effect, brainwashing local into uncritically accepting the empire as the culmination of a historic will, celebrating their own defeat. An entire generation of yes men, complacent in their subservience, was fostered. This was buttressed by the Indian concept of dharma, used to assimilate dissidents by convincing them it was a moral duty to accept the status quo. For instance, in the name of dharma, Gandhi used enlistment in the Indian Ambulance Corps to help the company during Boer War. Collaborationist nationalism at its best. Even the Bhakti tradition's principal modalities, the rasas, encouraged servitude. However, Guha attacks this myth of benevolent guardian state. The colonial state, unlike the metropolitan bourgeoisie state, lacks hegemony since it has not been able to assimilate. The civil society relies upon coercion. The army and the bureaucracy imposed control on the press and even public services by introducing municipalization, all in the name of order. In the countryside, the villagers were forcibly recruited for construction works, in plantations and in war. This was reinforced further by danda, the indigenous notion of dominance imposed through caste sanctions and patriarchal moral codes which induced allegiance to dharma. There was not much change in the nationalist struggle as well. The nationalists were keen on mobilizing the masses since it would imply that the latter had submitted the loyalty to them from the imperial rulers. According to Guha, they deemed it as an emblematic of the hegemony which was believed to be crucial to its ambition of building South American nation state. They dreamed of enthusiastic mass congregating in public spaces to declare the war for their beloved motherland, sacrificing their savings and security of their homes to enlist as members of the great freedom struggle. The boundaries of caste, class, gender and regionalism will be transcended for the sake of the nation. The willful enthusiasm mentally conjured up nationalists was to be a contrast to the colonial fantasy of collaboration. However, in discrediting the colonial empire and claiming it to be a dominant state without hegemony, it unwittingly revealed its hegemonic ambitions. Guha draws attention to the tactics through which the participation was extracted during the Swadeshi 1903 to 1908 and the non-cooperation 1920 to 22 movements. The non-cooperation movement was a call to reclaim the lost prestige under the imperial regime. In opposition to the proposed visit of the British royal family member, allegedly to sell a false perception of content subjects, Gandhi planned for counter demonstration like hartals, strikes and local boycotts of functions intended to celebrate the visit. The Swadeshi movement tried to further cement the perception of nationalist leaders as the true representatives of the people, but it failed miserably and a splintered hegemony was revealed. While cases of physical intimidation ranging from destroying imported goods to attacking individuals who dealt with administration were not unheard of, caste sanctions resulting in social ostracism were the more dangerous weapons in the armory of Swadeshi leaders. Withdrawal of ritual service, refusal of interdining and boycott of ceremonies were common tactics used to shame the dissidents. Such sanctions were heavily applied in the most politically active regions like in Bengal, paradoxically hitting at a strong relation between nationalism and casteism. Caste sanctions were most effective to induce conformity since there was little possibility of reporting them and ensuring humiliation. Although Swadeshi movement was meant to rescue people from the web of orthodox values and customs, it entrapped them further by employing traditional trupe of Sanatan Hinduism. Through the lexicon of Patakathas and Akara, sins committed through transgression of caste norms like routine of bath, meditation, worship or butchering of cows, the seemingly secular political movement was recast into the throes of religion, equating patriotic duty with dharma. For instance, refusing to go through the ritual of oath-taking in support of Swadeshi or wearing Rakhi on the wrist as a mark of solidarity with the campaign. Moreover, Tadrupaya, the rule of resemblance, was also used to include or exclude the blacklisted items and thereby expand the scope of sin and impurity. It was creatively used to encompass goods from Germany, Britain and Austria deemed impure like chinaware, leather shoes, colored prints, cigarettes, sugar, salt and cotton textiles. Other anti-Swadeshi transgressions included pollution by samsara, contact or association, a sin often incurred by Brahmins who did not stop offering their ritual services to the individuals who were being excommunicated for anti-national activities. Besides Brahmins, barbers and washermen, tradesmen and agriculturists, even doctors and lawyers joined the bandwagon. In denying to the clients not supporting Swadeshi movement, Guha states that since the political ethos was so entrenched in Hinduism and the discrimination between purity and pollution established as a defining principle of the nationalist conduct. Liberal professions identified with modernity, and secularism was seduced by the same logic. Hence, he argues the essentials of Indian politics can never be grasped without an understanding of religion. Rabindranath Tagore was a vitriolic critique of this kind of mobilization, entrenched in force and the isolating impact it had on people. As opposed to galvanizing them into action, Gandhi too was critical to a certain extent, to be critical of those sanctions he termed a social boycott, which included the denial of service, which he condemned as barbaric and inhuman. He preferred political boycott, which meant to deprive oneself by refusing to accept water or food at the hands of those boycotted or enter into marriage alliance. But these lines, Guha argues, were very easily blurred. Moreover, the elitist strain in the movement showed up in the leader's denunciation of the subaltern participants. Gandhi expressed his distaste by labeling it mobocracy, loathing their lack of premediation. Guha counteracted that the subalterns willingly imposed discipline on themselves as they mobilized for corporate labor, local conflict, or communal rejoicing. Yet a code was laid out for crowd control, not only measuring out spots at which the people have to gather, but also at what intervals should the national cries be allowed. This was not only about physical control, but also about soul control, a concept yet again borrowed from the spiritual vocabulary. All these ended up alienating Muslims, peasants and workers. Clearly the nationalist movement failed to live up to its own ideal. Tensions within the national historiography. Guha states that with the onset of an all-India mobilization for nationalist struggle, the Congress presented itself as the sole spokesman for people. It staked its claim to hegemony and pressed it against not just the colonial regime, but also against the Muslim League, left nationalist and socialist parties. The Congress had to confront challenges to its claims of representativeness time and again by the peasants and workers. The party's unitary notion of nationalism had to contend with the two-nation concept proposed by Muslim League. The interest of the peasant could not be included within any of its programs and could not be entrusted to a party comfortable with pre-capitalist mode of production, and paradoxically served to strengthen the British reign. The workers too were deeply influenced by socialist ideologies and the October Revolution, as well as by the impact of the Depression, and hence had become militant, perceived to be unresolved threat by party. It based its hegemony claim on the basis of the Indian past, which varied according to the different strains in nationalist historiography. From Gandhi to Rabindranath Tagore to Nehru, the past has been imagined in multiple ways, as an autonomous civil society, as spiritual achievements, as moral superiority, or as secular unity of politics and fusion of diverse cultures. As such, a body of literature accumulated during the period spanning from Swadeshi to the Quit India movement. Guha traces the birth of native historiography to colonial officers' attempts to harness Indian language for consolidating their rule. It gradually bore the stamp of its colonial predecessors, with the present marking the point of departure and detachment from the Puranic discourse. Negative accounts became secularized and could qualify for the epithet of history. Adoption of Bengali as the official medium of public instruction, rising demand for historical literature and Orientalism strengthened the impulse further. It enabled natives to redefine their identity by appropriating indigenous history. This fledgling nationalist historiography was to counteract the spurious claims of hegemony by the Raj, as propagated by James Mill's tradition of colonialist writing on the Indian past. However, its claim to the hegemony was as unhistorical as the colonial rulers. This proclivity for a progressive, liberal spirit in accordance with modern nation-state formation has now been fully formalized and established as part of India's official history. However, Guha accuses it of being just as elitist. While its emphasis on mobilization could counteract the misnomer of collaboration rampant in colonial historiography, its assertions of unquestioned authority are specious. Likening the Congress to a messiah reading his devotees of spiritual liberation, nationalist historiography tried to drum up the image of clueless masses who were to be led to glory. It also absolved the Congress of its ineptness in reconciling opposing factions. Guha laments that the nationalist historiography also failed, since it did not question the necessity of the colonial state. It clung resolutely to the pattern set by British pedagogy manuals that merely trace the reign of Governor General's administrative measures and incorporation of regions into the empire. The other stream of native accounts, though critical of British renderings of the past, was only meant to correct the kalanka, slander against the Indians, and to acquire some prestige, not to forsake loyalty to the company. Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's agenda for Indian historiography in 1880 marked an incipient nationalism. Rejecting British writings of the Indian past, in Banga Darshan he urged a local rewriting essential for Jati Pratishta, nation formation. He also devised the concept of Bahubol, physical strength to counter colonial construction of the frail native. Yet it did not suffice as a mechanism for undermining the foundation of the Raj. Guha contends that a critique of the bourgeois ideology must materialize from a historically antagonistic universe. He insists that subaltern politics holds the key. It embodies the notion of dharmic protest, including mass desertions by laborers, peasants uprising, sitting on hartal, withdrawal of labor, or denying special service as against elite collaborators. Challenges and criticism. Following Guha's contribution, there was an implosion of views in the arena of subaltern studies, which will be fruitful to pursue. Sociologist Vivek Chibber, in his post-colonial theory and the spectre of capital, is skeptical of Guha's claim that the bourgeoisie democracy of post-colonial India could qualify as a dominance without hegemony. He argues that none of the bourgeoisie revolutions, whether of the English or the French, were ever hegemonic. Thereafter, he proceeds to uncover the past of these revolutions, trying to prove that neither the revolution in England targeted feudalism nor the French Revolution participants were capitalists. Chibber also accuses Guha of harboring a Whig view of history. In addition, he alleges that Guha had claimed the hegemony of the bourgeoisie was based on the inclusion of the subaltern's interest. Thus, to conclude, in this module we have learned that the colonial historiography, which is very complex, has tried to pose hegemony as one of the main instruments through which the British ruled India, and it also talks about how it was through hegemony that the middle class intelligentsia constructed the whole nationalist movement. However, as revealed in this module, we have seen that the subaltern groups and its histories was equally important in the fashioning of the nationalist movement and even in the politics of the post-independent or post-colonial period India and its politics. Thank you.